When one thinks of the Catholic Church today, quite often the city of Rome comes to mind. It is a seat of power, the city of emperors, of popes, and of saints. It is the center of Catholicism and the see of Peter. But it wasn't always that way. Paul, in his epistles, writes to several local churches throughout the world. But these aren't churches as you and I are used to them. No, these were more like communities run by local bishops and presbyters, quite often meeting in the houses of wealthy patrons, nobles, or even just renting out a building, or, since they were a Jewish sect in the beginning, meeting in the local synagogues. As these churches grew in size and numbers, the power over smaller communities around them increased. These smaller communities owed allegiance to the larger churches who claimed to have doctrinal authority. The idea of apostolic succession, which we touched upon briefly in a previous video, is what gave these larger communities their spiritual authority. The first, and the leader at first of these communities, was Jerusalem. Tradition, which is really all that we have to go on here, claims that James the Just founded the church in Jerusalem, though there is some reference to possibly James and Cephas, referred to as Peter, might have founded it jointly. Other churches claim to have the apostles as well as their founders. Constantinople claimed Andrew, Antioch claimed Paul, and Alexandria claimed Mark the Evangelist. But what about Rome? Enter Irenaeus of Lyons. He was just the man that Victor, the Bishop of Rome, needed. Victor had tried exerting his influences over several minor churches in Asia Minor. He was rebuffed. He then tried excommunicating them. This did not work either. In fact, he was rebuked by several of the other episcopal sees around the world. He simply didn't have the authority. Rome, while the head of the secular community underneath the emperor, was really just a minor Christian church. It wasn't even considered a patriarchate up until the time of Pope Hadrian I. Victor needed someone to give him some backing. Rome had little to none. Irenaeus had already given Rome a boost under Victor's predecessor, Eleuterus, inventing a chain of legitimate succession of 12 bishops of Rome, from Linus to Eleuterus. This came in handy, having a loyal scribe willing to prop up the authority of Rome, to which Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons in Gaul, modern-day France, was faithful. He wrote how Peter and Paul had come to Rome with the express intent of founding the church there. Unfortunately for Victor, this was not enough, and his authority over the patriarchates would not be universally accepted until the mid to late 8th century under Pope Stephen II, when he sent the forgery known as the Donation of Constantine to Charlemagne's father, Pepin. Stephen and his predecessor, Hadrian I, needed the support of a strong ruler, as the empire had been moved, initially by Constantine, to Constantinople, and the lands in the west were being lost, even as the power of the Bishop of Constantinople was increasing. As was expected, the Bishop of Constantinople, Istanbul as we know it today, by mere proximity of being by the emperor, was able to exert considerable influences over the other churches of the Christian world. Roman priests and bishops, for example, were not permitted to have sex, and while this never stopped a single one of them, it was still a practice that was solemnly upheld since the time of Pope Synesius in 386. However, Eastern priests and deacons were not forbidden this. They were allowed to marry. In fact, only bishops were called to celibacy. This was not the first, nor the last time that the Eastern Church would ignore or defy the orders of Rome. This and a few other factors would eventually lead to the East-West Schism in the 11th century, where everyone was excommunicating everyone, and basically they were acting like little children arguing over how many legs centipedes have. But more on that in a future video. But here's what you really need to know about Rome. It was the center of the Roman Empire, but not initially the center of the Christian world. During the 3rd century, it began gaining power and it claimed Peter as its founder. In the 4th century, the bones of Peter were conveniently found and were venerated in a marble tomb by Constantine, which about 100 years later was immediately lost and then not found again until 1941. By the late 4th century, the seat in Rome was called an apostolic see, the Bishop of Rome was called a pope, and claimed power that was initially only given to synods. Other councils gave precedent to the seat of Rome as it was the center of the empire and thus the church. This was first done at the Council of Nicaea and then at the First Council of Constantinople. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the Muslim world was conquering everything and was continuously dwindling the power of the other patriarchates. By the 8th century, the secular power of Rome had pretty much fallen apart and was really not paid any attention to, while the positions inside the church were regularly bought and fought over. And by the 11th century, a full 1,000 years after the teachings of Christ, Christianity, minus some pesky Greeks, looked to Rome fully for its spiritual guidance. The imperial court had fallen, and the ecclesiastical court had risen.